There's no one way to be a Rhodes Scholar, which is important to keep in mind because they don't sit there with a checklist of prioritized activities, of one activity over the other. At the end of the day, the scholarship is meant to assess your personality and character.
Hello and welcome back to the One Take Show podcast. In this episode, we are in conversation with incredible Anupriya Dhonchak. Anupriya is a Rhodes Scholar and an incoming BCL candidate in Oxford University. She is about to graduate from NLU Delhi. In this episode, we talk about everything that concerns Rhodes Scholarship. Obviously, we talk about the application process. We also try to figure out if there is a roadmap that law students can follow in the law schools that can help them become a more suitable candidate for a scholarship like Rhodes. And we also learn more about how and why one should pick a scholarship like Rhodes and what are the ancillary factors that can help us, for example, SOPs, voluntary work, or any other such factors which are really involved in this entire process. If you like this episode, make sure you like, share, and subscribe to the channel. If you have any suggestions or feedbacks, write them down in the comment section. I would love to read them. As ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let's jump right in. Hello Anupriya, welcome to the One Take Show. It is truly an honor and I'm so happy to have you on this podcast. I think with time, I have really looked up to certain law students who have pushed the envelope. And when I was researching for this episode, I was reading your LinkedIn profile. I mean, truly, that profile itself is a role model. So thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. I'm truly, truly happy that we had this opportunity.
Thank you, Costa, for having me and that very, very kind introduction. Before we begin, I just wanted to anyone who's listening, I hope they're keeping safe, their family is doing okay in these times. And also, if you're listening and you have the resources to help out, please do donate to COVID relief efforts because we're all in this together, but the pandemic has worsened inequalities in our country like never before.
Absolutely, especially I think when we talk about states specifically, there is situation is just getting worse. I don't need to get into the specifics. I'm still sort of in middle of all of that. Hopefully, holding strong. Nonetheless, we all need to keep going strong with this process. Eventually, we'll get out of it. But before we get into this conversation, obviously everyone is waiting to hear more and more about your experience with Rhodes and everything that went right for you, everything that you realize worked for you and all. But before that, I think it's really important that we learn from your experience in law school. So my first query was obviously that did you always have it in your mind that you have to curate a profile in law school that is going to help you or aid you for any application process like Rhodes maybe down the line?
Not at all. I think, especially in the formative years of law school, um, I knew, like everyone does, you get to hear from the grapevine that there's a scholarship like the Rhodes. Uh, we all, I think, knew about it by first year that only one person has bagged it. But honestly, that was all. I came to law school with an open mind and to try different things. With respect to my law school journey as well, I feel that in so for instance, the things that now in hindsight stand out to me were things that were not planned as such. So during our first year, we had a couple of really passionate professors and a few very emotional lectures where the entire class was very moved. So you come to law school, you're in your bubble, and then you learn about these things that compel you to think outside of it. And for the term papers that I was writing then, I just wanted to do justice to the course that was being taught and the professor who was teaching it. It was only like during the Viva stage or when I was getting feedback on my paper was I told that it's a paper that can potentially be published. And that's, I think, one of the first instances when someone that I really respected reposed faith in me and I felt that I could make meaningful contributions. But again, this wasn't a very engineered process. All I was trying to do was to make the most of what my professors were teaching me then.
Right, right. And you've done almost everything in law school. You've debated, you've participated in some debates. I saw Mukmam there, and you've participated in negotiation mediation competitions, for example, Warsaw. And I believe you've mooted as well. You've written, obviously, you've written a lot. When I was researching on it, there were tons of papers and articles that you worked on, and even recently you've been writing very actively. So all these various activities that a law student could undertake, what do you think is the most perhaps useful, if we talk about from a particular perspective of a scholarship? What are the activities that one should keep in mind while being in law school that could help them out for this purposes of this scholarship?
Right. So there's no one way to be a Rhodes Scholar, which is important to keep in mind because they don't sit there with a checklist of prioritized activities of one activity over the other. At the end of the day, the scholarship is meant to assess your personality and character, and even the criteria that they assess you on are very broadly worded, and it depends on candidates how they link their experiences to demonstrate that they fulfill that criteria. So it's not like moods take precedence over something like publications. Uh, if you're applying for a postgraduate degree, then sure, academics assume importance. What I can tell you about the Rhodes Scholarship is the four criteria that they judge candidates on. The first is academic excellence, then the ability to use your talents to the fullest. Academic excellence you can show through your grades, through papers that you've written, research projects, etc. Ability to use your talents to the fullest, again, you can show through your co-curriculars, extracurriculars, uh, sport, art, music, dance, theater, anything actually. Like, it just shows that you're a whole person who has interests beyond just what's there on your CV. Uh, then there's truth, courage, devotion to duty, and moral force of character and instincts to lead. Again, it's not. I mean, you don't need to have opened an NGO in order to be able to demonstrate things like these. It's just about the work that you've done and how you think that ties into these criteria. Uh, People don't reverse engineer the process. So you can't think about these criteria and then do work. The work that you put in always precedes your desire to apply for the scholarship.
Right.
Applying for the scholarship is a byproduct of your passions and interests.
Hmm. Absolutely. So your entire law school does not need to be predetermined in order to clear this scholarship. A very fruitful sort of a law school would automatically help you if you're really passionate about this scholarship. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, and it's not even, I mean, you can't write about your journey or predict your journey before undertaking it. I think it's counterproductive to make a very rigid plan and then stick to it concretely because you give up on the opportunities for self exploration and discovery that law school provides otherwise. So,
Right, right. I had one very interesting question, which I think the last conversation on roads that I had was with Manshuj Ravi Jain, and I couldn't ask him this question, but it's a very interesting one. Although Rhodes Scholarship is de facto one of the most reputed scholarships available, why did you choose Rhodes? And was there a particular intention in mind before choosing Oxford, or was it just because Rhodes offered the possible opportunities that it did?
right. So for me, during law school, I really enjoyed analytical work and I was appreciated for it during my internships and during various projects that I took up, which is why uh, I had started to think seriously about reading for a postgraduate degree in law. Then I think the Bachelor of Civil Law program at Oxford sits very well with my courses of interest, which is why that was always, I mean, not always, but by the end of third year, beginning of fourth year, when I decided that I could potentially apply for a master's degree. So that was something that I would be interested in. Then the Rhodes is obviously an extremely prestigious scholarship, as you said. And but I think for me, one of the other motivators to apply also was that it assesses your personality and character holistically. And the point of the scholarship is not, which is why I mean you can choose to do any course at Oxford. and you don't have to stick to what you've written about in your personal statement or anything. But it's the fact that they assess candidates based on their motivations, what drives them. And I thought that that was something that really fascinated me, that they're not just judging candidates based on what's there on their CV or what grades that they've got. Also, it is an extremely, extremely inspiring community. When I was applying for the scholarship and researching, I came across amazing work that scholars had done in the past. And I think it's an opportunity to learn so much if you're a part of a community that's as inspiring as the Rhodes.
Right, right. And subsequently, when you talk about this entire scholarship, one of the biggest factors that one has to take into consideration is that it's very difficult. One of the perhaps one of the most difficult scholarships to get, especially when one wants to study law in post graduation. So when we talk about this application process particularly, I think we can divide this part of the conversation in two parts. One is the application process itself, and the second one is the interview. So, with respect to the application process, did you have a particular experience? For example, anyone who's watching this conversation would absolutely love to know about your strategies, or perhaps the tips and tricks that you use with respect to the SOPs or letter of recommendation or something that all was involved. So, could you please give us a little bit of an insight in that area?
Right. So for the personal statement, it's a 1,000 word statement that needs to tell your story. Um, it has to be, it has to reveal who you are, and most of the questions in the interview are based on things that you said in your personal statement or your CV, which is why it's important to be authentic and honest in that, because the interview process is pretty rigorous and thorough. What I did was I would the writing the personal statement involves a lot of introspection. So I would take long walks sometimes, or just generally keep it at the back of my mind. I was preparing for other things as well at the same time. So, but because it was at the back of my mind, whenever I had a thought about what my personal statement could be or what I could include out of my experience in it, I would just jot it down. So either create a Word document or just write it down if you prefer longhand. Uh, Other than that, talking to friends or people who've known you over a very long period of time also helps if you're confused about something or if you want their insight. Um, and then the application also involves submitting 6 letters of recommendation. The point of those letters of recommendation is for 6 people to vouch for you, to attest to your character, personality, potential in detail. So it's important to choose people who would be as invested in your application as you are, and people who can comment closely and in detail about your abilities. What I did was I reached out to, fortunately, everyone agreed. So I reached out to 3 of my professors as my academic references who I'd worked on long term projects with. For my non academic references, I reached out to my sports coach who I trained with in high school when I was playing badminton nationals, and 2 other people that I'd interned with during law school. Um, that's for your LORs, and they're definitely a distinguishing factor for the scholarship committee to consider, because 6 people's detailed accounts about a candidate can be really revealing. Other than that, you have to submit a 2 page curriculum vitae, which is pretty standard. For the interview, we had 3 interviews, even though usually there's only 2 interviews that are conducted. And that's again a very rigorous process where they quiz you on your CV, your SOP, and your general motivations and character and things that are happening in the world, and your ability to form an informed opinion about everything that's going on.
Right, right. So maybe we can go backwards from here. When we talk about interview, the first question that obviously comes to my mind is that there must be two types of questions. Obviously, 3 interviews, very rigorous process, must have required a lot of preparation. So, firstly, what was your preparation like for interviews? And secondly, were there certain questions that you could call the HR questions, the template questions that we should naturally prepare for or that we should expect? And finally, when there were questions which were specific in nature, how did you tackle them?
Right. So, a good thing I think about the entire interview process was that the the interviews differ amongst each other, but the questions, at least from my experience, they were very tailored to my application. So they were not your stock questions or your generic HR questions. They were actually, they reflected the fact that the panelists had spent time reviewing applications, and they were invested in the interview process. So the first interview was a preliminary interview, and it had panelists who were from the legal field. So it was more technical than the other interviews. But at the same time, you know, I mean, this would differ for everyone. So they do quiz you on things like your hobbies, how you're keeping up, what's there on your personal statement, apart from the technical bits. The other interview had a panel which was very diverse. There was an anthropologist, a historian, um, and there was just one lawyer on the panel and people from other fields. So in interviews like these, it's important to to be able to make your ideas intelligible to those who are not lawyers by profession. And my strategy for preparing for these interviews was to prepare elevator pitches for the research that I'd done, so that I was not making the panelists go through everything, which was very obvious in my research, but only talking to them about the most interesting findings uh, in a very like short, summarized way. Apart from that, it's important to think about questions that would arise when someone reads your CV. So, what you would call HR questions, to think about your motivations and how you would articulate them to a committee that's asking you questions about that. It's a detailed process. And honestly, the second interview was, I mean, they just keep asking you follow up questions based on what you say. It was very thorough for me. Uh, every panelist had, I think, prepared questions that they wanted to ask me, but also were asking impromptu follow up questions. So they'd come with certain questions which were related to their field and which had intersections with my areas of interest and their field. So it's important to be thorough with everything that you've done. I watched a lot of online content as well. I saw a lot of webinars because there was an explosion of online teaching and lectures, etc., on YouTube, and I quite enjoyed the preparation process despite the stress, because it was basically reading in more detail about things that I'd worked on and things that I was interested in.
Absolutely. And was there any question that stood out for you that you still remember? Maybe give us a taste of what exactly the interview was like. Was there any question that stood out for you?
So in my final interview, I was asked that I have worked on intellectual property and also equality law a lot, and I was asked that they're often thought of as very disparate fields. So equality law is your classic public law subject, and intellectual property is a private law, mostly to deal with contracts, corporates. And I think that was a very interesting question, and that spoke directly to my interests, and that allowed me to also articulate the intersections that I saw between the two subjects, which had inspired me. So, I mean,
Right.
questions are like that. They're not just very generic. They're very tailored to the work that you've done.
Right. That is, in fact, a very interesting question. I'm almost tempted to stop this conversation about roles and talk about that particular question, which, if I may be lucky, I would get to learn more about this in future from you. But maybe going a little back, when we talk about the application process, there are two major questions that come to my mind. Firstly, when it comes to a template profile, for example, there are expectations that you must have a very good CGPA in your law school, or that your academic performances need to be very good, or that you must have a holistic uh, co-curricular background. For example, you must have a sports background, or you might have a cultural background. When I say culture, I mean obviously dance, drama, or anything of that sort. And that you must have done some community service and all. When these various factors come into play, how indispensable do they get? For example, if someone has not been in sports, or if someone might have not done very good in academics, or maybe someone has not debated much, or has mooted much, or has written much, is there a way out, or should we then prioritize accordingly?
So, for academics, the I mean, because academic excellence is one of the criteria that the scholarship, the trust judges candidates on. Uh, and I think practically it's important because the Rhodes Scholarship is a fully funded scholarship to study at the University of Oxford. And your Oxford applications are independent of your getting the Rhodes Scholarship, which is why the trust needs to look out for candidates that it thinks will actually make it to Oxford. And Oxford has certain very rigorous criteria for academic excellence for admission into its various programs as well. So, which is why grades do assume significance. Uh, then, with respect to sports, not at all. Like, sports is definitely not indispensable. There are so many people who won this scholarship and who very openly admit that they're not athletic and don't play sports at all. Because, as I said, the criteria is to be able to show that you've used your energies to the fullest. And that is a very broadly worded criteria. You could have used your energies to the fullest through literally anything. So it's just about tying those dots and like connecting those dots for them and making that connection for the committee. And it's sports is definitely not indispensable. Community service too, again, it doesn't have to be that traditional idea of community service necessarily. Through your work, through whatever you've done, you just have to show that you did care about other people while you were doing your work, because the scholarship is ultimately the trust is looking for people who are passionate about making a positive impact. And that's all that you need to be able to demonstrate.
So there's no one cutout format of community service, or that you need to have worked in a particular area. You could have worked in any way possible, but must have had a positive impact in the community that you can include in the application process. Fair.
Right.
So when we move forward from there, and I'm sure that you must have researched on the previous patterns of Rhodes Scholarship application process and how the committee functions, last couple of years, how it has worked. And then now, when we have a pandemic upon us and the entire process must have transformed in one way or the other, I assume it must have. If it has, what are the changes that you must have observed, and if those changes were significant enough for you to have made modifications in your application process?
Right. So, because of the pandemic, all our interviews were online, which is different from getting the chance to actually interact with the panelists. Which is something that we missed out on. And to also interact with other people who are like who are finalists or semi-finalists at the interview stage. Again, I've heard that that itself, although it can be a nerve-wracking experience, but it also leads to people fostering a lot of friendships over common like shared stress, etc. So we missed out on that. But apart from that, another change was the introduction of an altogether new interview because they were only assessing us online. So they had a third interview this time. There was an intermediate interview between the preliminary and the final interview. Another thing that I heard that they did was talk to your referees to get an even clearer idea about the candidates because they wanted to be super thorough this year because they weren't like seeing us in person. Apart from that, I think it was quite unchanged in terms of what the scholarship is looking out for.
Right, right. And I think you've already explained about the SOPs, and you've given a very thorough idea as to how one should approach. But I think one of my last questions in this segment would be that when we talk about statement of purpose or any essay that we write, and you've said that you've jotted down various ideas that you've had over a period of time, and finally you compile them. But there is a presumption that whenever, sort of a running narrative in law schools, that if you apply for example, let's say for any scholarship or any application in the universities outside, you must have a story behind you, a story that is compelling, perhaps emotional in a way. I don't necessarily understand that, but something, a story that must be unique to your profile and something that must convince. For Rhodes Scholarship particularly, did you have to craft any such story for yourself, or was your statement of purpose just your motivation and inspiration to study in that university?
I don't think that the two are necessarily unrelated. So your motivation often stems from your unique experiences,
Okay.
from where you've come from. And my personal statement reflected that. It reflected
Mm-hmm.
why I was sensitive to certain issues,
Mm-hmm.
why my work in even seemingly disparate areas had those intersections. And
Mm-hmm.
honestly, for me, like while working on those areas, it wasn't a very conscious decision to look out
Mm-hmm.
for those intersections.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking about those intersections was an afterthought. It
Mm-hmm.
just like I had organically explored my interests at law school,
Right.
and while ruminating about what kind of work I had done, I also became aware of those intersections and how they were
Mm-hmm.
tied to my intrinsic motivations for maybe reading the law or taking up those projects in the first place.
Right, right. Um, I do have a follow up question here, and I think it's a little sensitive of a question, and you may choose not to answer it. But the question is that for perhaps someone like me, a heterosexual male, perhaps coming from a privileged section of the society, who does not necessarily have any particular grievance to or any such drawback to particularly be passionate about, or if I may not have chosen any passion project as of this now, this moment, do I then have to necessarily look for things that I'm passionate about and then craft my entire profile accordingly? Or can I generally have passion for law or perhaps, let's say, civil law if we are going for BCL? Will that work or should I necessarily work on the other direction?
Um, see, it's you can possibly be intentional about the work that you're putting in, your how you're using your time and efforts, but I don't think you can manufacture a motivation for something, which is why it's more organic and less artificial and deliberate than that, in my opinion. At the same time, you don't need to have had a grievance, but it's just thinking very deeply about what is it that drives you, and just thinking about the kind of work that you've done and asking yourself, why was it that I took up this work? Why was it that I chose to do this amongst all the other options that I have? We are making decisions uh, throughout our life. Some of those are, I mean, there are obviously accidents in the middle. Sometimes we don't have a choice, etc. But it's thinking about how all of that has shaped you. So a good SOP is very personal. Uh, it does speak directly to your unique motivations and inspirations. And because the scholarship in particular is looking for people who are passionate about making a positive change, then I think like it's important to have had something that you cared about and that you applied yourself to and that you worked towards consistently.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for answering that question. Sort of answer, like it's really solves one of the biggest problems, or perhaps a query that most of the students have, when it comes to the so-called manufacturing of your passion, which you don't necessarily have to do. You can really be passionate about something, and can be reflected in your SOP. Perfect. So my last set of questions for you is: firstly, when we talk about Rhodes Scholarship, what is your future game plan that you might have thought about and you might have approached Rhodes with that game plan? Is it academia, or do you plan on doing something else afterwards?
Yeah, I mean, if you have figured out from my answers so far, I'm not a super planned person. I'm not a very rigid planned person. I
Mm-hmm.
am flexible and open to
Mm-hmm.
opportunities. I do have some ideas about the
Mm-hmm.
subjects that I'm interested in. Right now, I'm just very, very eager to refine my craft and
Mm-hmm.
to engage deeply with the material and professors and peers and learn at
Mm-hmm.
Oxford for now.
Right.
Obviously, there are things on my radar, but I don't have like a very specific concrete plan that do this by 24, 25. I'm
Mm-hmm.
open and flexible to things.
Well, that is incredibly comforting, particularly because you don't necessarily need to have a proper game plan till you're 30 in order to sit for Rhodes. You can simply be passionate about the subjects of laws, and then perhaps, just like any other law student, figure it out on the way. Is that what you're suggesting? Perfect. So, last question that I have for you is perhaps something that I also personally want to know, is that when you look back on your years in law school, and when a junior comes up to you like me and asks you that, is there any suggestion that you would like to give to someone who wants to perhaps maneuver through law school in a better manner, or make the best out of law school, what in your opinion that could be, that suggestion would be?
I would say try different things. use the time that you get very, very, I mean, it can be put to use very nicely because you get a lot of time and space for growth in law school. So, and I hope that you will find something that you enjoy and can also excel at. But the only way to find that authentically is to be open to trying different things in the first place. I would also say that do remain in touch with your hobbies. That's something that I think really helped me throughout law school. So whether it's playing a sport or art. For instance, I was a part of many sports teams in my college and also a part of the poetry club in college. So just things like these that help you unwind. At the end of the day, they're very important to keep you centered and to help you remain honest to yourself. And finally, don't judge your successes or failures by other people's yardsticks. Everyone has very different and unique constraints and motivations at all points of time. So, yeah, don't get too bogged down by pressure, and I hope you'll figure it out.
Right, perfect. I think this is the kind of advice that everyone, especially my peers, need in law school with the kind of situations that are now changing the market, and now that we have to really worry about our employability, especially coming from law schools. But nonetheless, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation, Anupriya. I think anyone who tunes into this conversation will really enjoy and learn more and more about this entire, really tedious, very hard, and a very exclusive sort of a application process that Rhodes Scholarship needs and the qualifications that it requires. And I think they could really learn from you and from your time, from your experience. Thank you so much. If you have any closing remarks for our listeners.
Thank you so much for having me and for listening in, and I hope you stay safe and take care.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.